Hey, and welcome back. Today we're headed up to Appleton, Wisconsin to check out Rock Garden Studio. You may recognize this space from a video I released last year, recording an album in one day with jazz vocalist Aaron Krebs. I've been fortunate enough to record at this studio a number of times over the years, and in today's world where digital technology has changed the way a lot of music is recorded, Rock Garden Studio is creating music with much more of an old school feel, with mostly analog practices. The owner, Marc Golde, invited me up to chat about his experience recording drums and working with musicians in the studio. His passion and understanding for recording music is clear from the get-go, and I'm sure you'll learn as much as I did. Before we get too far into the video, I want to remind you that I'm creating new videos on this channel all the time, so please consider subscribing to stay up to date on all of my future video releases.
Hello there, Mike.
Hey Mark, thanks for having me today.
Yeah, thanks for coming down.
So for the people who don't know you, could you give me a quick background of your career in music and starting this studio?
I was a young musician. Started piano lessons when I was 5, had my first bar gig when I was 10, left high school when I was 16 to go on the road with my band. By the time I was 18, I was all washed up. But I had always recorded, even when I was a little kid. So at one point, I thought it would be something that I could offer the marketplace that other people didn't do. And back in the early 90s, you either had a little 4-track at home to do demos or you were in a professional studio. There's nothing in between. So I worked for another studio for a couple years, and then that's where I kind of cut my teeth. It was called Bonsai. And then eventually opened my own place, and that's where I've been.
The timing of you getting into recording, I think, is really pivotal because in the 90s, you didn't have this full embrace of doing everything on a computer quite yet, right?
Well, when I started was the early 80s. I had an analog reel-to-reel 2-track that I could overdub and do multi-speed. I could do double speed, half speed. So I learned the art of recording analog. And you could buy recording tape at Radio Shack. So it was so common. It was just a normal, common thing. So computers, the first time I saw music coming from a computer, it just seemed like a toy to me. You know, this isn't real. It's, you know, this isn't the future. What are they talking about? This is a video game. Well, it was the future, and we're here now. But back in the 90s, musicianship was a lot different because you couldn't fix anything. You know, you might be able to punch in some stuff, some vocals, but it was very difficult to do, and you had to have a relationship with your performer, and the performer needed a relationship with the engineer on timing and where to punch in and where to breathe and all that stuff. So it was very, very difficult to do, where now I can just auto-tune. And no, we don't use the word auto-tune, it's pitch correct. Yeah. Because I don't use Antares, I use something different. But same thing with drums. The drummer had all the pressure in the world because they had to play from the beginning to the end of the song perfectly, the way you want to hear it on the record. There's no editing, there's no splicing between takes, there was none of that. And we didn't use click tracks back then. Not a lot of people did. So you had to have good timing. Engineers used to joke of like, if I could only take the first note of the chorus from the second chorus and put it where the first note of the first chorus is, wouldn't that be Star Trek, you know? Now it's every day we're doing that stuff. Back then, you didn't even think of editing because it wasn't there. So it was all, you're a musician, you have to play, and that's it, you know? And if you suck, better luck next time. Then you'll know what to practice when you go home and you become better. And that's what recording did for people. It was really a learning tool as well as, you know, the art of the recording itself.
Well, can we head into the live room and kind of check out the drums?
Yeah, you bet. I love talking drums.
Now, one thing I've always found really unique about your space is that this live room has a ton of character.
Yes. Every room influences the drums, even if it's a dead room. I did experiments with this in other buildings and stuff, where I'd take a drum set in a controlled situation and record it, and then take a snake and put it out in a humongous parking garage and record the same drums, same drummer, same microphone, same everything in this other space. And the drums themselves, not just the ambience, the drums themselves act differently. And I think that's due to the sound pressure. So if you're in a small dead room with lots of muting around and stuff, where there's no ambient, it's also going to take away from the drums themselves. They will be inhibited, and versus being in a large space like this or being on a concert stage or something. I remember when I first moved into this studio with the live ambient room, other engineers around town were always talking like, well, you can't erase the room from the drum sound. You can't erase the room. I'm like, you can't erase your room from your drum sound either. It's always an influence. The thing with me, and we'll get into this, is how do I capture this space and control this space? Because it can be completely out of control. When I first moved in, I thought, okay, I got this big long room. Why don't we put the drums on one side and the microphones on the other side, and it's gonna sound humongous. But it didn't, because there was so much diffusion and such a time delay that all of those microphones were picking up as white noise. It was just with some drums in the background. Unless you're doing, sludge rock where you want, So that's where I ended up with the middle of the room with the drums. Now I can kind of control things. If your drum sound isn't good, your sound isn't good. It all starts with that. It really, if Saint Anger by Metallica, people hated that record because they didn't like the snare sound. It shouldn't matter, but it does. In my situation, it's very controlled. It isn't like I'm in a live situation or whatever. And through the years, I've gathered the equipment that I want that works for me. I've been through, a bunch of stuff, and I've solved a bunch of problems. That's kind of the big thing is, okay, it took me 10 years to get a good kick drum sound. Literally 10 years before I found something that I really liked. And it's a combination of all sorts of things. Preamps, microphones, the drum itself, the person hitting it, where you place the microphone, the room it's in. That's all these things come into play. So that's, drums are a real passion, not just for me, but for everybody who records.
Yeah, and I think a lot of that is because you have sometimes 8, 10, even 12 to 16 microphones all having to work together in harmony. For me, I've always found it's kind of the biggest challenge when I've personally recorded, and I'm a little biased because I'm a drummer, so I'm more dialed into those sounds in general, but sure. I've kind of found that a lot of recording engineers also share a similar sentiment.
Well, one of the things, without getting into too much of the technical stuff, is you want everything to be in phase with each other. And phase is, if you're looking at a waveform, the up and down and up and down. If you have two microphones that work against each other, certain frequencies are going to cancel out between the mics. And when you do that, the sound gets small and whiny like that. So what you need to do with the kit is you need to be aware of phase and have all these microphones working in phase together. And I listen to my early recordings and I hear like tom fills and they go tick, 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 tick. And I know those toms sounded huge. It's because they're out of phase. So one of the things is my overheads. I use an XY pattern. Most people don't use an XY pattern. They use the spaced pair. And I do this for two reasons. One, when I'm mixing a kit, I want to be able to close my eyes and feel like the drummer is in front of me playing. And I do everything in my power to create that image of a real drummer. Like if I listen to a Led Zeppelin record, that's John Bonham. He's right there. I feel his presence. He's right there, especially if you listen to it on a really good stereo. So same thing here. A spaced pair is kind of when you're just looking at cymbals and you'll have one mic way over here and one mic way over there. And what that does is it gives you the ability to pan stuff really wide if you want, but things are going to be out of phase. In an XY pattern, the two microphones are virtually in the same spot. So everything on the drum kit is exactly the same length to this mic as it is to that mic. So once I get a drum in phase, it's in phase in both of the microphones. Here, if I have a spaced pair, now this cymbal is farther away from that mic, but it's closer to that mic, so there's going to be a slight phasing right here. Same thing with that, or your toms, or the whole thing. So you're kind of chasing that sort of thing. And there's a tendency, I know some engineers really like to wide pan, so the hi-hat's way over there, ride cymbals way over there, rack toms over there, this is over there. The only time you as a listener could get that perspective in nature is if your head was right here. And your head's never going to be in the drummer's lap. So You're never going to hear this width Even the drummer himself sitting here, him or herself, this is not over here, this is not over here. So to me, it's completely unnatural. But there are some records that I've enjoyed that do it that way. I want the sound to develop before it gets to the microphone. So I want the microphone to be as far away from the source before it gets influenced by something else, which means, say, on a guitar cabinet, on a speaker, I want to be far enough away, but before I get a reflection off the floor, before I hear the room, whatever. Because if you're dialing in your amplifier, your ear isn't right next to the speaker. You're hearing what it sounds like diffused about 4 feet away. Same thing with a drum. I've seen lots of sound guys do this with snare drum mics, like that, or toms like that. Why is that really what you want to hear? Is that little corner right there? I really don't get it. The drum is happening here and the sound is developing here. If I had my way, the microphone would be there. But now we're influenced by everything else in the kit, so we have to get closer. Where I place the snare mic has to do with the balance that the drummer has between their hi-hat and their snare. If they can be light enough on the hi-hat and heavy enough and tight enough and heavy enough on the snare, I can get away from the snare a little bit, a couple inches, and it sounds great. Well, the worse that ratio gets, the more that snare mic has to come down here. And soon, I'm right on top of the drum, and I'm only capturing one little part of the drum. I'm not capturing this. I'm not capturing what your ear hears when you're sitting here. So that's a compromise. I have to do it sometimes because people are bashing with this hand and tapping with that hand. And I've used one on the bottom also to capture the snares, perfectly out of phase, so I flip the phase in there. And the key to using a bottom mic on a snare drum is by itself sounds terrible. It's a terrible sound. But if I've got some hi-hat bleed that's too much and I got to bring the treble down on the snare, this gives me a little more treble in the mix. So, or if I want it to sound more snary, it's there, so it's a great option there. Last miking thing is the room mic. Now I have this large room, and typically I'm using one mono microphone, usually a condenser, and I face it into this convoluted area here because it has the most diffusion and it looks crazy, but it's awesome. And then that's usually good enough blended in however I want to. Some people use stereo mics in a big room like this, and it's just so big and unnecessary. If I were in a smaller room, if I were in a room half the size or a quarter of the size, I would definitely use stereo mics because I'd get more excitement out of the room then. But for this room, it's excitable anyway, so one mic has always been kind of good enough for me. I try not to tell anyone how to play, that's really up to you. But I could say, hey, can you a little lighter on riding the crash cymbal and a little heavier on the snare drum to give me a little better balance? And usually when I make it aware to them, then they're like, oh, okay, yeah, I can do that. But when you're just, if you haven't really recorded much, you don't know those things. So yeah, the most important thing is the moment this tip hits that drum. If that doesn't happen right, none of this matters. Nothing matters at all. I have this house kit, 90% of the projects use this kit, and the drums sound different with everyone who sits here. So that's the most important thing, and then it's capturing it after that.
Yeah, well, I think you bring up a great point, and something I've experienced when I've worked in different studios is most of them have some house equipment available, and a lot of times it's because they've tried different things and then made choices. It would just be easier for me to have this because I know that this will get the sound that I'm looking for, right? Mm-hmm. So why don't you talk a little bit about the equipment you've collected for this sort of stuff over the years and your thought behind acquiring it?
Okay. So we'll start with the drums, the DW kit. It was one of those things where I knew nothing about DW except for that they were expensive. I had a Mapex kit and I kept adding on to it. I kept finding toms the same color and stuff, so it was a pretty large kit. And I recorded that for 10 years, and one day I was walking past it and I looked down and I said to myself, I'm really sick of this drum set. don't know why. And I kept walking all the way to the music store, and they happened to have this used set of DWs, which I could do it. I had 2 bass drums and all this stuff, so I was able to trade up into a really nice kit, and it didn't cost me that much more. And then I learned about DWs after the fact, that the shells are actually tuned to a pitch. And once you get the heads tuned to that pitch, the drum resonates, and it truly does. I hear it in the control room when this thing is out of tune or in tune. So it has that kind of resonance, and I love the attention to detail. Typically, if I'm recording jazz, the drummer's bringing their own kit. We're not using this set. So I'm not concerned with this being a kit for everything. This is a pop and rock drum kit. The toms, I want them to sound like cannons. I want doo, kind of like the drum fills in Open Arms by Journey. That's kind of my ideal big drum sort of thing. If you're the type of drummer who has a unique sound and a unique setup, by all means, bring your kit and we'll record that. But mine is this.
Well, and in this industry where a lot of times you're working on an hourly rate, it's like your ability to be efficient and not waste time searching for problems is really important to your customer.
That to me, that's another reason to have a house kit and have it all set up and ready to go, is that I have to charge money for what I do. This place is expensive, and I'm not the cheapest in town. So I don't want to waste anybody's time. I don't do a lot of experimenting anymore. I've kind of went through the experiments and I know what results this or that'll do. And if we're looking for something neat, we can do it. But for the most part, I typically want to hit the record button 30 to 40 minutes after the band shows up, which means I've got all this stuff worked out already and there's no guesswork, and I can adjust things from there if I want to. But the initial setup, you come down, maybe you brought your own snare drum, maybe your own pedal or something like that. We should be doing a drum check in 5-10 minutes. This is a different situation than you'll find in most modern studios. I'm very much, you could say I'm stuck in the 70s or whatever, but the same way I record out there, I'm recording air that is produced by humans. Here I am capturing human performances. And I found that the really great sounding analog gear, super, number one, enhances the sound. 2, you don't have to process as much. And it's much more fun. I can just be a balance engineer and not worry about tone shaping and all that stuff because it's kind of already there. I have this vintage console. This was installed in 1973 at the Indigo Ranch studio in Malibu, California. It has over 100 gold and platinum records to its credit. It's a one of a kind. Took forever to broker the deal to get it. I bought it as a fixer-upper. It took a year to restore, and then probably another 6 years of second run-through restoration, kind of, because there's a lot of parts you have to replace. And you're gonna get some cold solder joints, so the second comb through, and now the thing has been very, very dependable, and the thing's going on 51 years old. There are modern conveniences out there. There are other ways of doing things. This is just my way of doing things. I like this sound, and I don't have to work for it. I look at other people's Pro Tools sessions, and every track has 3 to 12 plugins. I'm like, then the sound couldn't have been good to begin with. Then there's something wrong there. If you need that much to correct stuff. Me, great drummer, great sticks, great snare drum, good mic technique, great preamps, great converter, comes back to channel 3, it still sounds great. I don't have to do anything.
What would be some pieces of advice you could leave for drummers coming into work in a studio setting like this for the first time to, be, I guess, agreeable with the engineer and adaptable, right?
Okay, well, there's 2 different situations. There's a hired session musician, and then there's someone in a band. Those are typically the 2 types of drummers that would come in. Drummer in a band, you don't know what you don't know until you record somewhere. So get as much recording experience as possible. Get a new demo for your band every year, every 6 months. And it doesn't have to be in an expensive, fancy studio. It could be another studio. You're gonna learn something every time. Balance is always important. Getting a balance. Again, people bash their cymbals really loud and don't pay too much attention to what the snare sounds like. Those are all the things that you learn. Now, what do I expect in a session drummer is completely different because I'm paying them, and I'm paying them not only for a result, but not to waste my time. Number one, we have a relationship. We've done this before many times. We know what to expect. The biggest thing is know the material before you get here. There's always a demo sent out, even if it's a singer, songwriter, guitar, vocal. Know the arrangement of the song or songs you're gonna do. Don't think you're gonna work it out here. You're wasting time. You're wasting my time. You're wasting the client's money. You won't get called back. You need to be able to handle curveballs, which means take your ego and chuck it out the window before you get here. If you have ideas and they don't get used, don't push your ideas on the engineer, producer, or artist. Say you heard the whole song halftime, but to us it's a regular time song. So now you're gonna have to adapt. Tempos may change. Learning to play to a click, a little faster, a little faster, a little slower, a little slower. That's a difficult thing to do. And for people beginning, working with a metronome and working with a click track, you don't always use it, but it's good to know it. To know what 120 beats per minute feels like compared to 123 beats per minute feels like, Playing ahead of the beat, playing on top of the beat, playing behind the beat. These are things I may tell a session player, I want you to be behind the beat on the verses and on top of the beat on the choruses. Tone, you have to make the drums sound good, not just hit them in time, but you have to draw the sound out of the drums for that style of music, whatever we happen to be doing. Is it a super snappy snare, top end kind of thing, or are we doing a big thud country music thing? Kind of all depends. But so I expect a lot out of a session drummer, and there's only a handful of guys I call, and it's usually for their feel and their tone. They can all play to a click. Why would you call one of the best guys in town to play something so simple? Because he does it better than everybody else.
Yeah.
And he can do things on command, and I can tell him the next time I want the kick drum pattern to change and whatever. He comes prepared, everything's charted out. I can throw curveballs at him. Sonically, every way. That makes a great session player. Oh yeah, and you have to play perfect.
Yeah.
On top of that.
Thanks so much for inviting me out here and kind of giving me a rundown of your approach to recording music, working with drummers, and creating.
Yeah.
So for people who want to follow you more and hire you to do work with, what's the best way to get in touch?
rockgardenstudio.com is where my email address is, and rockgardenstudio@gmail.com anyway. You can follow on Facebook. It's about the only kind of social media I do, or my personal page, MarcGolde.
All right. I'll have all that linked below, and thanks again for having us.
All right. Thanks for being here.